forces. Thank you.
I acknowledge the Honourable Minister Rodney Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I thank the Minister for agreeing to send this very important bill to a select committee for a few days for the public to have a say and for this Parliament to hear from experts. We have a simple parliamentary system here, and it's been called before unbridled power, and there are very few checks and balances on the power of this Parliament. One of the checks is a select committee scrutiny, which allows ordinary citizens to have their say and for official advice to be contested. And now one of the checks is that not one party usually can muster the numbers on its own to ram a piece of legislation through, and such as it was in this case, because it's very, very clear that the National Party wanted to move this bill straight through under urgency and to pass it into law. The ACT Party believes that would have been a very serious mistake. There's a lot at stake here, Mr. Speaker, and let me walk people through it. The first is that people say, well, it's very odd for ACT to be the law and order party and to be standing up on behalf of, shall we say, suspected criminals or criminals for their rights. And that's because, Mr. Speaker, if we are to have law and order, the critical bit is that the police operate within the law. Because if the police don't operate within the law, then in fact there won't be any order. And that's why we require and hold our police to operating within the laws that this Parliament makes. And so it's a very serious issue indeed if the police going about their business, not worrying about now that it's for a good purpose to put away bad people, they actually operate outside the law, because then you don't actually have a lawful society and you don't have the order that you'd expect in a civil society. And that's why we set a bar so high for our police. Justly so. The second thing, Mr. Speaker, is that this bill is dealing with a very, very important issue: covert surveillance by the police. Now, in other jurisdictions, the police, as arms of the state, can actually surveil who they like, covertly, and they routinely do. And they do that for all sorts of untoward purposes. And we correctly call such states police states, and New Zealanders don't want anything to do with them, because we want our police operating within the rules set by the people's representative, voted here on the people in this Parliament. And we don't want our police able to go about actually secretly surveilling on law-abiding citizens without the proper checks and balances that a civil society would put. And so you have to say, Mr. Speaker, that this is a very, very important issue, not a technicality, indeed. In fact, it was surprising to me to learn that the procedures were set up in 1957 before, I guess, we had the technical ability to do covert surveillance, and this law is so outdated that the police have found themselves in the predicament, and the police in charge of this particular inquiry told the High Court that he knew they were operating outside the law with their covert surveillance. And rather than having the Police Association now ring around MPs to try and get them to support this legislation under urgency, retrospective, why weren't the Police Association running around this Parliament to get the proper laws passed and to get them updated so the police could be doing their job within the law rather than operating as they knew they were outside the law? So covert surveillance by the police, Mr. Speaker, is a big deal for any civil society. The other point, Mr. Speaker, is we are dealing with a Supreme Court decision. Now, it shouldn't escape members in this House that the Supreme Court is the highest court in New Zealand. We sort of say that Parliament is the highest court in Parliament. look, we say that Parliament is the highest court. It's not. Parliament's not a court. Parliament is the highest court in the sense that it's a place where you have the debate and you make the laws. And it's the court's job to decide and to interpret those laws, and we keep in a civil society where we bridle power a clear distinction between the courts and this Parliament, and rightly so. And ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, what sort of banana republic is it? If the government of the day comes along and says, we don't like that decision of the courts, let's change the law, well, that's okay. But actually, let's change the law retrospectively because we don't agree with the implications of that decision on what it means to New Zealand. That, Mr. Speaker, is the definition of a banana republic. Why would you invest in a country that if you end up taking the Crown to court and they don't like the result, they'll just change the law on you backwards? We saw that with the foreshore and seabed, and we knew then it was a mistake, and this is likewise a potential similar mistake that needs very careful examination, Mr. Speaker. The next thing we can say is this. We're actually attempting to fix so-called the Supreme Court decision under urgency. And the proposal, Mr. Speaker, was to do so without it going to select committee. So we'd have this. We'd have the government of the day getting official advice, the only advice that they would get. There'd be no contest from the police and from the Solicitor General that was advising them in the court case that they lost to say, the Supreme Court's get it wrong, change it so we'll just pretend the Supreme Court didn't make the decision. In fact, we'll scrub it out of the books. Scrub it out of the books. And to do that under urgency, Mr. Speaker, makes it worse. So at the very least, Mr. Speaker, we have it going off to select committee. And then not only that, Mr. Speaker, to do so retrospectively. So what that would be doing, Mr. Speaker, is making what was now, and the police knew, unlawful back in the day, lawful. Parliament's the only place that can do that. So something was done unlawfully some years ago. This Parliament will come along and say, that's okay. The police were operating unlawfully. They knew they were operating unlawfully. We know that they were doing covert surveillance unlawfully. We'll come along and make what was unlawful lawful. That's Alice in Wonderland stuff. And I know, and I don't mean to pick on the Labour Party, but they made a similar mistake with the foreshore and seabed. And the best thing this Parliament can do is to hold its fire and listen to what the courts have got to say and make the law not become the court of this country. And we're going off to select committee, and I can tell members of this House, I don't know what the answer is. I'll be very interested in what submissions that select committee has on this bill and what suggestions we hear on this bill. I'm very interested in what the Labour Party has offered on this bill. But here are the things. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that we do want the police able to undertake covert surveillance. But we want them to do it under the law with the proper checks and balances, and I don't see that in this bill. I do not see it in this bill. It can't be beyond the wit of us to produce that. Second of all, I have a grave concern about the retrospectivity. We've been told about all the cases that will become, the cases before the courts that will fail. I asked the Solicitor General about that, and he said, well, actually, I don't really know. I just emailed all the Crown solicitors and said, how many cases have you got that could be affected? And he said, it worked out to about 40. Well, let's actually get to the bottom of how many cases are actually affected before we run off and do what is a constitutional outrage, and you'd need a pretty good reason for doing such a constitutional outrage. And let's also do this, Mr. Speaker. The argument is done that there's all these bad people locked up and because of the Supreme Court's decision. Actually, it's not the Supreme Court's decision, it's this Parliament and successive government's failure that is the issue here. Failure to update our search and surveillance laws and our laws for search and seizure so that the police can act in a way that people would think was reasonable. It's not a failure of the Supreme Court, it's a failure of this Parliament. Let's actually test the evidence and find out really how many people inside now are truly at risk of being let out and have an appeal under the law as the Supreme Court. I suspect, Mr. Speaker, not very many.
I call the honourable member